Jonathan Miller returned from war only to face a quieter battle at home. Decades of mockery and false rumors that stole his dignity in the factory where he worked. Behind it all stood foreman Frank Doyle and his loyal ally Mark Wilson, men who hid their own misconduct by turning Jonathan into a target. But when a young lawyer uncovered long-buried evidence, the truth finally had its chance to surface. And just wait until you hear the stunning twist that exposed the real culprits, and how justice at last claimed its victory. Jonathan Miller returned from Vietnam carrying more than just memories. He carried the quiet hope that life in America would finally bring him peace. In 1973, when he walked through the gates of a factory in Cleveland for his first day of work, he thought he was stepping into a new chapter. The machines roared, the smell of hot metal filled the air, and to Jonathan, it felt like a place where a man could rebuild his life. He wanted nothing more than to work hard, provide for his family, and prove that he belonged. But reality struck quickly. Instead of respect, he was met with whispers and sideways glances. The factory floor had its own unspoken hierarchy, and Jonathan immediately sensed he was an outsider. The first to target him were two men who held influence in the shop. Frank Doyle, an ambitious foreman who ruled the floor with sharp words and a sharper temper, and Mark Wilson, his loyal shadow, who repeated every insult and every laugh. Within weeks, they branded Jonathan with a cruel nickname, the Jungle Psycho. It wasn't just a throwaway line. It became a label, one they repeated loudly enough for others to hear. They said it in the lunchroom, by the lockers, and even when supervisors were nearby. The nickname carried a heavy implication that Jonathan was unstable, unpredictable, someone to be feared rather than trusted. The rumors spread like smoke. Frank and Mark hinted that Jonathan had done unspeakable things overseas, that he couldn't control his temper, that he was dangerous. None of it was true. But on the factory floor, perception mattered more than fact. Workers began to laugh behind his back. Some avoided eye contact. Others smirked when he passed by, as if they knew a secret about him that he couldn't erase. For Jonathan, the sting was sharper than words. He had survived years of war believing that, once home, he would be judged for his effort and his character. Instead, he was judged by lies. Each time he punched in at the clock, he carried not only the weight of his toolbox, but also the weight of ridicule. What cut deepest was management's silence. Supervisors heard the jokes. They saw the sneers. Yet no one stepped in. It was easier to let the rumors live than to challenge the men who spread them. Day after day, Jonathan realized that his dignity wasn't just being chipped away. It was being ignored entirely. The anger inside him was not the kind that erupted. It was quiet, controlled, and constant. He clenched his jaw, swallowed his pride, and focused on his tasks, refusing to give Frank and Mark the satisfaction of seeing him break. But each insult left its mark. Each whisper reminded him that, in the eyes of many, he wasn't a coworker. He was an outcast. The greatest shock of all wasn't the cruelty itself. It was how quickly it became normal. The nickname stuck. The laughter echoed. And what began as a few cruel jokes hardened into an accepted truth on the factory floor. Jonathan, the man who had given everything in service to his country, found himself fighting a new kind of battle, one he had never expected and one that left him completely alone. Years slipped into decades, and Jonathan Miller carried his burden in silence. He told himself over and over that he could endure anything if it meant putting food on the table for his family. Every morning, he laced up his boots, walked into that factory, and swallowed the same bitter air of ridicule. He endured not because he wanted to, but because he felt he had no choice. Frank and Mark continued to climb. They became fixtures of the factory, known as reliable men who got things done. Their reputation grew, while Jonathan's name remained stuck to the shadows of old rumors. He watched as they earned promotions, while his own career stalled. Not once did he fight for advancement, because deep down, he knew the decision had already been made for him. He was the man no one trusted. He was the one with the cruel nickname that never faded. Jonathan avoided company gatherings, holiday parties, retirement celebrations, birthday lunches. He stayed home or left early, always finding a reason. He couldn't sit in a room where the jokes might start again, where laughter might cut through him like steel. Instead, he chose solitude. While others toasted each other and shared stories, he remained at home, repairing small things around the house, convincing himself he didn't need anyone's approval. But isolation came with its own cost. At work, he was tolerated, not embraced. At home, He loved his wife Sarah and their children fiercely, yet even there, the shadow of the factory followed him. Sarah often woke to find Jonathan lying awake, staring at the ceiling. His eyes carried a weight she could not lift. She knew his thoughts were far away, sometimes in the humid jungles he had left behind, but more often in the cold, unforgiving halls of the factory. The pain he felt was not loud, not explosive. It was quiet, steady, and relentless. Every joke whispered in the break room reminded him that his dignity had been stripped. Every smirk when he walked by reminded him that he wasn't seen for who he truly was, but for the story others had invented. The years dulled his dreams. Once he thought he might rise to supervisor, maybe even run a department. Instead, he chose the safer path, working hard, keeping his head down, never stepping forward. He traded ambition for survival. His children saw a father who worked long hours, who rarely complained, but they never knew how much he had given up. Frank and Mark, meanwhile, looked untouchable. They shook hands with management, smiled for photographs, and were praised for their dedication. Jonathan knew the truth, but truth meant little when wrapped in silence. And so, the decades continued. The war he thought had ended never truly did. Only this time, his enemies did not carry weapons. They carried clipboards, hard hats, and false smiles. And each day, as Jonathan tightened his grip on the tools in his hands, he fought not against a distant foe, but against the crushing weight of being unseen, unheard, and misunderstood. For 30 years, Jonathan Miller's life followed the same quiet rhythm, the factory floor by day, restless silence by night. He had long given up the idea that anything would change. But sometimes change comes from the most unexpected places. It began when the company itself came under scrutiny. Regulators had started to look closer at the factory, suspecting years of mismanagement. At first, Jonathan barely paid attention. Investigations had come and gone before, always ending with the same men still in charge, still untouchable. But this time was different. This time, the company had hired a young lawyer named Lisa Harper. Lisa was new, not yet hardened by decades of workplace politics. She carried with her a determination that others had lost. She began combing through old records, reports, and employee complaints. She looked not only at what was written, but at what was missing. And soon, a troubling pattern emerged. Whenever the names Frank Doyle or Mark Wilson appeared in connection with complaints, the files seemed to vanish, safety concerns erased, harassment reports ignored, entire incidents quietly buried. Lisa's curiosity turned into resolve. She knew she couldn't piece together the truth without speaking to those who had lived through it. And one name kept surfacing in whispers: Jonathan Miller, the man who had spent decades in the shadows. When Lisa first approached him, Jonathan wanted nothing to do with it. He had spent years protecting himself by staying silent. Speaking out meant reopening old wounds, and he wasn't sure he had the strength. "It won't change anything," he told her. "It never does." His voice carried the weight of someone who had been let down too many times. But Lisa didn't walk away. She returned the next day and the day after that. She didn't push with accusations or promises. Instead, she listened. She showed him the records she had uncovered, the gaps, the missing files, the erased complaints. Slowly, Jonathan realized that she wasn't chasing a headline or looking for personal gain. She was chasing the truth. One evening, sitting in his modest kitchen with papers spread across the table, Jonathan finally began to speak. At first, his words came haltingly, as though dragged from a place long locked away. He told Lisa about the whispers, the mocking nickname, the way Frank and Mark had twisted his image to shield themselves. He spoke of promotions denied, of years spent in silence, of being painted as weak so that others could rise. For the first time in decades, someone was not only listening, but writing it down. His testimony was no longer just his private pain. It became evidence. Evidence that fit into the missing pieces Lisa had already uncovered. Jonathan didn't know if it would be enough. He didn't dare dream of victory. But as he watched Lisa carefully organize her notes, he felt something he had not felt in years: the faint stirrings of hope. Hope that the truth, long buried, might finally rise to the surface. The day of the commission hearing arrived with the weight of decades pressing down on Jonathan Miller's shoulders. For years, he had walked into the factory as a silent man, carrying his dignity in pieces. Now, for the first time, he was being asked to carry his truth into a room where it would finally matter. "Why, The hall was modest, rows of chairs, a long table, a microphone that seemed far too intimidating for its size. Jonathan sat quietly at first, listening as lawyers read statements, as papers shuffled, as the weight of procedure threatened to drown out the humanity of it all. But when his name was called, something shifted. He rose slowly, adjusted his jacket, and walked toward the front. His hands trembled as he placed them on the table. For a long moment, he simply breathed, feeling every eye in the room on him. Then, with a voice that carried both fragility and steel, he began to speak. He spoke of the rumors that had followed him for decades, of the cruel nickname that became his unwanted shadow. He spoke of the promotions denied, the nights without sleep, the silence he carried for the sake of his family. His voice shook at times, but his words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through the room. And then came the evidence. Lisa Harper, the young lawyer who had fought to bring his story forward, presented the documents she had uncovered, records that had mysteriously vanished, now resurfaced. Testimonies from other workers, men and women who had once stayed silent, were read aloud. Piece by piece, the story formed a clear picture. Frank Doyle and Mark Wilson had spent years covering up safety violations, falsifying records, and shifting blame onto others. The irony was unmistakable. The same men who had mocked Jonathan, branding him as unstable, had built their own careers on deception. They had used ridicule as a shield, their cruelty a smokescreen to hide misconduct. And now, in front of the commission, that shield shattered. The decision was swift. Frank lost his pension, a lifetime of benefits erased in a moment of truth. Mark was dismissed in disgrace, his reputation dismantled by the very lies he had once told about others. Jonathan did not celebrate. He did not stand tall with victory in his eyes. Instead, he sat quietly, his shoulders heavy, and let out a long, steady breath. It was the exhale of a man who had carried too much for too long. In that moment, the weight he had borne for 30 years finally began to lift. News of the hearing spread quickly through the community. Local papers carried the story, neighbors stopped Jonathan on the street to shake his hand, and strangers nodded to him with respect. For the first time in decades, he was no longer defined by a cruel nickname or false rumors. He was defined by his endurance, by his truth, by the fact that he had refused to break. For the audience, whether sitting in that hearing room or hearing the story years later, the message was unmistakable. Injustice can linger, lies can live for decades, but truth, no matter how deeply buried, does not disappear. It waits, and when it finally rises, it brings with it not just justice, but inspiration. Jonathan's story was no longer about pain. It was about resilience. It was about the power of standing firm, even in silence, until the day the world is finally ready to listen.